No. Thanks to our online folks. I saw Gretchen and CJ and Debbie and Denise, right? Anybody else pop in?
Nope.
Cool.
Hi, everybody.
So we're going to talk about the book of Ruth today. It's a short book, only 4 chapters. But I bet if you've been around church world for a while, it's a book you're aware of, you know, you kind of have an idea of the general storyline. So if you don't, we'll try to get some of the highlights. Here's the title of the book. These 3 letters are Ruth, R-T, R Bob T-H. This is the word for scroll. So remember, the book of Ruth is part of the 5 scrolls that are used as part of 5 Jewish religious festivals. And so this is the scroll, megalith of Ruth. That's how you say, right? Ruth. Works pretty well. The scroll of Ruth is literally what it means. So again, we're in the 5 scroll. Ruth is interesting. So let's talk about where it falls in the Hebrew Bible versus the English Old Testament. If you're familiar with the idea of the English Old Testament, which you probably are, you know, it's Joshua, Judges, Ruth. Why is that? Well, the first verse of Ruth, wrong way, starts with this: in the days when the judges judged, or when the judges ruled. So the book of Ruth itself tells us the time frame in which these events took place. And so naturally, when we have the English canon, it made sense to put it right after the book of Judges. So you've got the book of Judges that talked about that period of time. And then here's a story of someone who lived during that time, Ruth, when the judges ruled. The Hebrew Bible, as we know, puts it in the last of the 3 sections, far removed from Judges, in the books, the section called the Writings. And actually the Hebrew Bible, depending on which one you pick up, has 2 different orders for where it puts Ruth, which is interesting. One order is based upon this, called the 5 scrolls around the Hebrew holidays. And so this is the order that these 5 books would fall in this version of the Hebrew Bible, because this is the order on the calendar these festivals fell. The second place that Ruth is sometimes put in the Hebrew Bible is immediately after Proverbs. And that's because, interesting little twerk, how does Proverbs end? Proverbs 31, if you remember, is the virtuous woman. It's the A to Z, or Aleph to Tav. It's an acrostic poem, 22 verses about a virtuous woman. And some organization of the Hebrew Bible puts Ruth right after that, as if to say, here is a story of a virtuous woman. So here's the generic characteristics the Proverbs talk about, and here's a fleshed out version of that person. I don't think it matters either way. Any of those placements, it's fine. It certainly makes sense historically in the way that we're familiar with it. But in the Hebrew scrolls, this is not. Well, why is it not connected to the book of Judges when it's right there in the Hebrew Bible? Well, if you remember when we talked about the historical books, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, we called them the Deuteronomistic history. It's a fun word, right? If you remember that phrase. What's that?
Deuteronomistic.
That's a word. So Deuteronomy is the last book of the Torah. And then these historical books are called the Deuteronomistic history because they show the history of Israel as they struggled to maintain faithfulness to the covenant. So those books, in some people's mindset, fit together because that's what it is. Now, Ruth doesn't fit in that style. It's not like some of the other books that are talking about the people of God keeping the covenant of God and either receiving the blessings for it or suffering the difficulties or curses because they don't keep it. Ruth is not about that. The reason Ruth is not about this is because where is Ruth from? She's not an Israelite. She's a Moabite. She's not Jewish. So a story of a person who's outside the covenant people of Israel, wouldn't fit in that Deuteronomistic history. And so if you're looking at that Hebrew order, those historical books fit that design, that model. They're trying to show the history of Israel as it related to the covenant, their faithfulness, or more often than not, their lack of faithfulness to the covenant, and how that sort of knocked them around a little bit. So there's kind of an opening idea of Ruth. Now, what we don't have in Ruth is any indication of who wrote it. The book is named after its main character, but she is not the author or claimed to be the author of the book of Ruth. Likely this was written after her life, and the key we have there is the ending of the book of Ruth. It's the only book in the Hebrew Bible that ends with a genealogy. And it's a very specific genealogy. It's the genealogy that connects us to King David. That's where it's pointing. The last 7, 8, 9, 10 verses of chapter 4, actually the last 3 or 4 verses, I went too long, go from Perez to David. So we have a very interesting ending to the book. And if that is the ending of the book, the only way you can write the genealogy as a genealogy is after those people have happened, after they've been born. So that gives us the idea that though the period covered in the book of Ruth is when the judges ruled or when the judges judged, it's not written necessarily in that time. It's written down later and is connected. This story of Ruth is connected to David coming onto the scene, being born, and the promises surrounding him. And so there we go.
Naomi was Jewish.
Naomi, yes. Ruth's mother-in-law was very Jewish. We'll talk about that as we get into the book, yes. But Ruth herself is not. By the way, well, we'll get to the genealogy. I have more to say about that when we get to the outline. Well, why don't we just go to the outline? So to give you an outline of how the book unfolds, the first few verses tell us that this Jewish family, Elimelech is the patriarch, Naomi the matriarch, flee from Israel to Moab because there's problems. There's a famine there. While they're away, we get the next section. There's tragedy that befalls. Real quick kind of synopsis. They move there. Elimelech dies. His son married Moabite women. Both of his sons die. Both of Naomi's sons die. And so Naomi at that point decides, I've got to go back home because there's nothing for me here. I have no connection. This is a foreign nation. My only hope is to go back to my hometown and hopefully somebody there will take care of me. And so she wants to give her daughter-in-laws freedom to leave. She says, you ladies, you go back to your people because I've got to go back to my people. And Orpah takes her up on it, but Ruth says, nope, I'm going with you. And she follows Naomi to Bethlehem. Ruth runs into Boaz. How does she do that? Well, she comes back because of the circumstances. She and Naomi are, they're destitute. The culture is a patriarchal culture. Everything is connected to the patriarch, the head of the family. And so without a husband, without a son, Naomi has nothing. And Ruth, being also a widow, but additionally a foreigner, has even less hope than Naomi has. And so they come back. It's the time of the barley harvest. So we're in the spring of the year when this happens. They come back. And if you remember the Levitical law, it would say when you harvest your fields, if you drop something, you don't pick it up, you leave it there, and you don't go to the very edge of the field. You leave that for the orphan and the widow and the foreigner that are in your midst. And so Ruth goes to a field to take advantage of that law, that as the reapers drop barley, she's able to pick it up and she's able to glean from the sides. Actually, she gets a little special treatment from this particular landowner. I believe he tells some of his workers to drop a little extra for her. And so she meets Boaz. she goes home and tells Naomi of her day, and Naomi has a plan. I have an idea. Turns out Boaz is a relative of Naomi's. And we'll talk more about the Levitical and Deuteronomy law that says the relative of a widow has a responsibility when she has no male heir to come in and play the redeemer, to be her advocate, to marry her, to get her land back, to give her a son to carry on her husband's name. And so Naomi, knowing Boaz is that person, has a plan, and she tells Ruth the plan, and Ruth executes the plan, and Boaz says yes to the plan, and it's a wonderful thing. And so we see in chapter 4, Ruth and Boaz are married. Dun, 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 dun. And they...
I have
Yes.
a question. Naomi, is she, you said that Ruth is outsider.
Right.
She's not among those Christian people. But Naomi is a Christian family,
Naomi is Jewish, yes.
Jewish, but Ruth isn't Jewish.
She's
She
from
got
Moab.
married to Jews.
She married Naomi's son.
Right, okay, got it.
Yes. So she's an outsider. Interestingly enough, Moab, if you read, I think it's Deuteronomy 23, because of how the Moabites treated the Israelites as they were making their way to the promised land, there's a I think it's Deuteronomy 23, 2 and 3. I could be wrong there, but it's a law that says they'll have no part, and they can't go into the temple in Israel for 10 generations. 10 isn't an exact thing. It just means for a really long time, forever and ever. Amen. It's kind of an exaggerated thing. So Moab is not often considered, friendly with Israel because of some things that happened along the way. But nonetheless, Ruth comes in and she's married to Boaz. She has children, and the line of Elimelech continues, which brings us to that closing few verses, this genealogy that connects this Moabite woman to King David. Pretty significant stuff. So that's the general outline and overview. Makes sense? Like I said, it's a story you're probably kind of familiar with, I would guess. We learn a little bit about Elimelech and his family. I put verse 2 up there. They were Epaphrites from Bethlehem, Judah. That's a pretty significant place, right? And they went to Moab and lived there. This is verse 2. So things happen fast in this earth. So you should recognize this word, and for sure this word and this word, not just from the law, the Tanakh, but from biblical prophecy, right? Micah 5:2. Remember that one? We talked about it. The prophecy that the Messiah will be born in Bethlehem when the wise men go to visit the Messiah, and they go to King Herod, and that's that. But you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, are by no means least among the children of Judah. So these three terms, a city, a tribe, and a people, very important in the prophetic picture of the Messiah. And why is that? Because they're also very important in the prophetic picture of that one who will sit on the throne of David. Why did Joseph go to Bethlehem when he was to be taxed? Because he was the house and lineage of David. So this little town of Bethlehem, to coin a phrase, how still we see thee lie, is pretty significant. And so as we're reading it, and particularly if you were, this is written likely after David has come onto the scene. It's written probably during the pre-exile monarchy at that time. And so these are very significant place names. But here's another thing. You know what Bethlehem means? If you break it down into its parts, Beit Lechem, the house of bread. And the story of Ruth tells us that in the house of bread, there is no bread. There's a famine. How about that? And what do? In the house of bread, this promised place, they went to Moab and lived there. Here's your map, in case you're wondering. So Bethlehem, very near Jerusalem, Dead Sea, so let's give you an idea of where we are. And so for them to go to Moab is not a simple journey. It's not a quick journey. They have to go around the Dead Sea and a little bit down. This part, after the Moabites opposed them, they took over some of this. This became part, as you see, the tribe of Reuben. So they've got to come down here into Moab below the Arnon River. That's kind of the barrier we see elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible to come. Now, Moab, if you remember, is significant. Moab, should we just ask the question? Does anybody remember who the Moabites are descended from? Lot. Abraham's nephew, Lot. So the Moabites are related to the Israelites, just like the Ammonites and the Edomites. Edomite, Esau, Ammonites. There are all these people around here have connections to the people of God. Moabites, the people of Lot. And so here they come. They leave the house of bread to go to Moab. It's a pretty fascinating trip. Yes, sir.
Now, where's the Tigris and Euphrates? Up that way,
Over
okay,
here.
because that's still part of the biblical story, Euphrates and Tigris.
We've left there
Right.
already early on. So this is the Fertile Crescent. So we've got Egypt down here, Nile River Basin up through this part of Israel.
Okay.
Nile's down here, up around the Jordan River, and then this is all desert, and then across up here and down is the crescent with Ur of the Chaldees and Haran, where Abraham was, and then the Tigris and Euphrates, Babylon.
Well, 3,500 years ago, that was fertile ground.
Yeah. So
So they, okay, because you have to make bread out of grain. I know that you can grow wheat that. So,
well, it says about this, it's the barley harvest when they come home.
yeah, he mentioned that.
So
Okay.
this is a very fertile area.
Okay,
Not so much on this side, but definitely on this side of the river.
thank you.
And
You
so,
answered all the questions before I even could ask.
okay. So that's why, again, why is it called Bethlehem? It's the house of bread. It's the bread basket, we would say. Like we have the bread basket of our country. This would be similar. And so this gives you an idea of the places that they are. So backing up. So that's what they do. They leave the house of bread because there's a famine. And they eventually have to come back. Now I touched on this, it's kind of fascinating. The book I mentioned a few weeks ago, The Epic of Eden, really goes into not just Ruth and Naomi, but the society, and talks a lot about why this unfolds the way it does. Because it is a patriarchal society, meaning for a widow without husband and with no male children, she had nothing. She had no standing. She had no rights to do anything. There was no provision for her at all. She was
Almost starving in
totally,
the streets
absolutely.
with no man.
But God knew, because God is God, that things happen and sometimes tragedy happens. So he puts in the law specific provisions, both for the land that needs to provide the income and the stability for a family, and for the need for an heir that would be the male heir to carry on the name of the family. If you remember, when we come into the promised land, what happens? The land is divided and it's given to families. So the clan, we know the 12 tribes, actually 13, but the 12 that get allotments, because Levi doesn't, are given their lands. And then it's subdivided among the heads of the different families. So if I'm of the tribe of let's say, Judah, and I'm living around Bethlehem, my family has a piece of land that is my family's in perpetuity, that I will have it and I will pass it down to my children, and they will have it and they will pass it down to their children and they will have it. Now, sometimes things happen and your land that you had wasn't yours anymore because you were in such a destitute situation. This is what happens here. They're so destitute. Not only do they don't just sell the land, they abandon the land to go to another land. And naturally, what's going to happen? Probably somebody else is going to go, well, Elimelech's field is barren, and I know is bare, and they're not around, and it's time to plant. So I'm going to plant some barley, and maybe a couple of families or maybe just one begin to horn in. And so Elimelech's land, while they're gone, is overtaken by somebody else. But in the law, there's a provision that if you lose your land, you get your land back. You can redeem your land. You can do it by either, if you're alive, you can go to the person who has your land and buy it back, pay the right price, and it will be yours. Or in the event you can't do that, there's a provision that in the year of Jubilee, it will automatically revert to the family to whom it was given, no matter what. No, the debt doesn't have to be paid. The debt is considered paid by the produce of the land over that period of time. Very specific Levitical and Deuteronomy law. Actually, Leviticus 25 is where you get this land redemption idea. Very
And when is the
specifically
year of Jubilee?
Jubilee 15 years, I think.
Okay, 15 years?
50.
50?
Maybe
50.
Okay.
At 7 sevens.
Oh, okay.
So, and if I'm in trouble and I have to sell my land because I can't afford it, the price is based on how many years to the year of Jubilee. So let's say I have an acre of land that's my family's. I'm destitute because I owe you a lot of money, Todd. I'm gonna sell it to you because I need money, and I'm gonna sell it to you. I know when the year of Jubilee is in 3 years, the price is a 3-year price. I think it'll produce $100 a year, so it's $300 you're gonna give me for the land.
So the price is dictated by that.
Right, but if it's 20 years
Yeah.
till Jubilee, it's 20 times 100. So that's a bigger price because you're going to benefit all that.
Right.
You're going to get the crop for that time. So that's the price that you're paying me.
Back then, if they lived the next 20 years. it's-
But the land it doesn't matter. It's a family land. If I die and I'm the patriarch, my eldest son becomes the patriarch and you give him the land. It's our family's
Meals
land.
in the family to put that.
Right.
Okay, so-
But what does Naomi have?
No man.
No family, no husband. And the husband's son, his heirs have died. Both his sons are dead. So they have nothing. So the Levitical law comes into play, not by them, but by a close relative. If they don't have someone, then the next closest relative, and that's where Boaz comes in. He's a close relative. Naomi says that. She's like, ooh, and he's a close relative. This is awesome, Ruth. That's like the specific Hebrew translation. And so
Yeah, I remember he has a big farm running.
he's a good
Yeah, she
well-to-do.
worked, Ruth worked that farm, and then that's how it happened.
Right. Exactly. So that's where she meets him. She goes to glean at his farm, and all of this transpires. So one part of it has to do with land. The second part of the law, and this is in Leviticus, this is in Deuteronomy 25. So Leviticus 25 is the land redemption. Deuteronomy 25 is the heir. If Naomi dies, or excuse me, if Naomi's husband dies, and now her son dies, she has no male heir, the family has done. He was the patriarch, the family's done. The law says the next closest relative is to take, not Naomi in this case, but Ruth, because she's of the right age, she's younger, as a wife, and give her a child. And the eldest male child is the same as if Naomi and Elimelech had him. Not Boaz's child, but Naomi and Ruth's child. He can have other children with Ruth, they're his. But the firstborn male becomes that new patriarch that gets the father's name, even though he's dead and not on the scene, and carries on the father's name and becomes the heir of all that the father had. It's a really interesting system. It's kind of foreign to us.
Yeah, I've never heard of it.
You know, but it was the way it went. So
But if that's how you keep the
Well, if I remember right, Boaz was not the closest. There was
Right.
another one that was closest. And so Boaz went to the other man, and the other man first said yes. Then he found out he had to marry Ruth.
you remember why he said yes? And then he said no?
Well, I guess it's because he wanted the land.
He said yes when he found out it was the land. He
Right.
said, yeah, I'll take the land. And then when he found out a woman came with it and an heir, he didn't want that. He said, no, that's too costly. And that's when Boaz was
Because he
able.
didn't want his first child to be
Right.
That other person.
He was fine with getting the land.
Right.
He wasn't so fine with the other part. Interesting, huh? And by the way, it's interesting. The idea of the providing an heir. You got to. I'm just going to go to it because this is kind of crazy stuff. Talk about stuff our culture doesn't understand, right? Deuteronomy 25. Let's say. Now, we'll just use Ruth. Ruth is to be redeemed. She needs a male heir to carry on the line. In Deuteronomy 25, it tells us, where are we? Verse 10 or so. Okay, if he says no, if a man does not want to marry his brother's wife or his close relative's wife, she shall go to the elders at the town gate, verse 7, and say, my husband's brother refuses to carry on his brother's name in Israel. He will not fulfill the duties of a brother-in-law to me. Then the elders of the town shall summon him and talk to him. If he persists in saying, I do not want to marry her, listen to this, his brother's widow shall go up to him in the presence of the elders, take off one of her sandals, spit in his face, and say, this is what is done to the man who will not build up his brother's family's line. And then that man's line shall be known in Israel as the family of the unsandaled. Do you think?
What?
The unsandaled. No sandals.
Unsandaled?
The barefoot family.
I thought you could smack with it.
She spit on is enough, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, let alone the sandal behind it.
How's that?
Unsandaled.
Now that tells that's we would know in our society that would be embarrassing for somebody to spit in your face. In our way of thinking at it, it's one of the greatest insults. Somebody spit in your face.
Yeah.
And not new. It would have been an insult in that day as well.
You don't even need the sandal now.
You don't even need it. There you go. But the point is, this is how serious the law took the family and the land tied to the family and their inheritance. So all of the story of Ruth revolves around these Levitical and Deuteronomy laws that were in play for the people there. Really.
Well, now I know why there's so many Jewish lawyers. They had to have explain all the rules. My goodness.
Well, in the United States, they had where the father would pass down land to each one of his sons. And the
Right.
ones would get the biggest share of it.
Right.
And sometimes the youngest didn't get any, but it would be passed down to the oldest.
Right.
Yeah.
So
And then
And-
they kept it in the family.
it's always the
And in
son.
Israel, that's why the eldest had the double portion, the double blessing, because if I'm the eldest son and my father is the patriarch, when he dies, I become the patriarch. So I've got to, and the responsibilities of the patriarch are huge.
Right.
We see it throughout the Hebrew Bible. When Lot gets in trouble and is captured, whose responsibility is it to gather an army and go get it? Abraham, because he's the patriarch. It was assumed. There are lots of places in the scripture where we see the patriarch had that much authority and responsibility. He could even, Judah and Tamar, that's a kind of a sordid story. But in that one, the patriarch ordered the woman's death, hearing that she had violated what he thought was decorum because she was pregnant, even though she wasn't with the child. Although it turns out he messed up, but that's another story. We won't go into that one. It's a fun one to read. It's right as Joseph's story at the end of Genesis, like 35, 36, 37. Joseph starts, and then we get Judah and Tamar in there. It's a fascinating story, but it shows the power of the patriarch. So this is the culture. This is the background to all this that's happening that we see. Now, why would this be kind of important? Why would this jump out at us? Because the underlying principle is something you probably heard of. It's the goel in Hebrew, or the kinsman redeemer, that close relative that has the responsibility or the right, however you want to look at it, a little bit of both, to step in and redeem the two most important things, the land and the line of the man that has passed away. So kinsman redeemer is the idea here that's happening. So we'll come back to that in a minute. Let's back up to this and remind ourselves where we are. In the days when the judges ruled, what were the days like when the judges ruled? Good, bad. Bad, right? I mean, things were crazy. One of the judges is Samson. Samson is a judge. He delivers Israel, but his story is a more cautionary tale than, virtuous account of a godly man. And in fact, as you go through the judges, it seems like the further we go, the worse they get. How many times does it say, you remember this refrain? There was no king in Israel, so everyone did what was right in his own eyes. That shows up several times in the book of Judges. That's the society. Would you say that would describe a faithful people or a faithless people? Faithless people, right? That's the thing that's happening. So historically, Israel has this rather difficult period of time where they've come into the land. They've been led by Moses, who was a good leader. There's not been a prophet like him in Israel since. And then Joshua, who sat at his feet, sat outside the door of the tabernacle when Moses was inside so that he could lead the people on these conquests and they take the promised land. And then we have this period of time where things just go to pot. Things get worse and worse, and it's chaos. And finally, they move toward the monarchy. And the second monarch of Israel is David, the one that this book points to, gives us a picture of his line. And is David good king, bad king? Good, faithful, a man after God's own heart. So the question that could be asked is, how do the people who exhibit such faithlessness give rise to a man like David, who, yes, had his problems, but overall God commended and blessed because he was a man after God's own heart? Well, the book of Ruth is interesting that it shows this family that does the right thing, including Boaz and Naomi and Ruth, in the midst of a generation that is not very faithful to God. And one of the probably most well-known passages in Ruth is Ruth's pledge to Naomi. Naomi says to her daughters-in-law when she's going back to Bethlehem, it's in chapter 1, verse 16 and 17, if you want to look it up, that they can go away, and one of the daughters does. But Ruth replies, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. And where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die. And there I will be buried. May the Lord be with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me." Now, this might have heard of this in weddings sometimes. But we've got a pretty bold proclamation of faithfulness. And who's making it? Ruth, who is an Israelite? No. She's a Moabite, the people that had opposed God. So this is kind of really odd that this is it. And then we've got this thing that we don't understand why culturally. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. The practice in that day was when you were buried, you were often interred or prepared for burial and done something with very quickly. And then later, after you decomposed a little bit, they'd gather your bones and put them with the bones of the rest of your family. By the way, we see this in Jesus's day. You might hear ossuaries or bone boxes. They're not, these weren't like, they didn't cremate people and fit them in these little boxes. After they decomposed enough, they would take their bones and put them in bone boxes and label them. And then they would put all of these bone boxes, these ossuaries, in a large tomb, and you'd have hundreds of them, or however many, of the family members in this family, their bone boxes gathered together. When Joseph and Jacob are in Egypt, what do they say? Make sure you take our bones back, because we're going to be buried with our people. Where you die, I die, and there I will be buried. So this is like serious commitment. that she's making, saying, I'm abandoning my people. Where you go, I will go. Your people will be my people. I'm a Moabite, but I'm abandoning them for Israel. Your God, my God. And we're stuck together. So Ruth has this incredible declaration that doesn't fit, and it wouldn't be expected, especially from a Moabitess, and by really not many people, because we're in the period of the Judges and everybody's just doing what's right in their own eyes, not doing what's right, period. There's a big difference in those things. So Ruth jumps out here as an example of that. I'm going to jump forward a few here. And one of the words that's key in the book of Ruth, actually, it only shows up 3 times in the book of Ruth, shows up 250 times in the Hebrew Bible, is the word hesed. And it's often translated loving kindness, steadfast love, unfailing love. Loving kindness and unfailing love are probably the ones that are most usual. It really depends on what translation you're using, because every translation uses a little different. And they don't always translate it the same. But actually, it's a guttural. So I said, you got to kind of clear your throat to say it. It's the, put another way, the covenant faithfulness of God to his people is how it's often used in Scripture, but it shows up 3 times in the book of Ruth. And I think it's instructive to look at those 3 times, because one of the images of Ruth is the kindness, the faithfulness, the steadfast, unfailing nature that we just saw in Ruth's confession of her relationship to Naomi. So it shows up 3 times. The first time in chapter 1, Naomi telling her 2 daughters, she wants them to go away. And she says, go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness, hesed, as you have shown it to me, to your dead husbands and to me. So may God show you his faithfulness, his kindness, his steadfast love, as you've shown it to me. So we can see that's an interpersonal level of hesed. Chapter 2, she's talking about Boaz. The Lord bless him, Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. He has not stopped showing his hesed, his covenant faithfulness, his loving kindness to the living and to the dead. This close relative who has agreed to be the redeemer of Ruth and Naomi has exhibited this. Now back to the point Mom made about the closer relative. The reason that part of this is there is because it was costly to do this. It was not like a free thing. It was going to cost Boaz some of his stuff, because what he's going to do is have a child that will not be his, and there'll be a lot of investment in this child. We didn't have to buy Pampers. They were probably not using any disposable diapers back in the day, but nonetheless, raising a child ain't cheap. And then to see that child leave, right, and go another way. This was not an easy thing. This was not something being entered into lightly, but it's important enough to Boaz that while the one close relative says, nope, not going to do it, can't afford it, it'll hurt my own inheritance, he's willing to show this kind of faithfulness, to sacrifice, dare I say, for the good of Ruth and Naomi. Yes, ma'am.
But he'll be able to have other kids, right?
Sure.
From boys.
Boys always
Yeah.
had the greater place in that society.
Mhm.
So it seems like the oldest was the one that brings.
Yeah.
The oldest always got the highest responsibility and the greatest share.
But if he had another boy after him, that would be
That would be his.
his first boy.
But see, Boaz already had children.
Oh,
This wouldn't be his only kids.
okay.
So does Ruth ever have any children?
Yes, she does.
How many does she have?
I don't remember.
We haven't got that far.
At least the one that's in the genealogy, right? So loving kindness. So Boaz shows love. So Naomi says the women who are not Israelites have shown faithfulness to her and her children. Here, Boaz has shown faithfulness. And now finally, of course, the Lord bless you, my daughter, he replied. This kindness, this is Boaz speaking to Ruth. This kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. This has said, you have not run after the younger men, whether rich or poor. I think this is a fascinating verse. What shows her commitment to Boaz? Her steadfast love, her loving kindness. There were younger and richer people she could have gone with, but she followed the covenant procedure when she found out Boaz was the close relative, and she went to him rather than trying to enrich herself in other ways. And so Ruth shows loving kindness. In fact, this is one of the places that we kind of see why Boaz was drawn to Ruth. Romantic love in marriage in that day is not the kind of the norm like we would expect. But certainly in this situation, there seemed to be a desire of some sort. I don't want to say attraction physically in that way, but a drawing of Boaz to Ruth because of this very quality. The loving kindness, the hesed that she displayed toward him. Now, it's 3 times in Ruth, over 250 times in the Hebrew Bible, most of often about God. And if we're going to talk about one that we've talked about a lot, which I didn't put in our notes, why don't we look at Exodus 34. And if you remember that from previous weeks, you know that's the moment the commandments have been given. People have been unfaithful. The golden calf thing has happened. Moses has gone back up with the new stone tablets, and he says, God promises to show him a glimpse of himself. And as the Lord came down, verse 5, in the cloud and stood there with him and proclaimed his name, the Lord, and he passed in front of Moses proclaiming, the Lord, compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger and abounding in love and faithfulness, abounding in hesed, maintaining love, maintaining hesed to thousands and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. This is how God describes himself in that revelatory moment in Exodus. And here in the book of Ruth, we have kind of woven throughout this picture of what hesed looks like. And Ruth becomes then this person in the genealogy. But more than that, I think it's a picture because of who she will be the grandmother of, I guess, great-grandmother
She
of.
was a great-grandmother.
Of the fact that this is how God interacts. In the midst of a generation that does what's right in their own eyes, God would still, in his covenant faithfulness, keep his promise. His loving kindness would endure to set aside, to find the most unlikely of people in a different foreign country, to bring her into the people of God through Ruth, or through Naomi and Boaz, to breed in her line the one who would sit on the throne, being David, and in whose line one ultimately the Messiah would come from. In fact, we get to Matthew's gospel, we have a genealogy, and guess who shows up in there? Our buddy Ruth. Is that important? Let's talk about the genealogy for a minute, because that's kind of an interesting way. Like I said, it's the only one that ends in a genealogy. We have genealogies throughout the Hebrew Bible, but this is the only book that ends in one. So, if the ending of a book tells you something, it tells you a little bit about the why of what's going on. And the point to throw this in at the end is that genealogies are fascinating in that, in this case, we see she's not too many generations removed. Like we said, the great grandmother of David, the hero king. We see she's not from the people of Israel. But when you look, let's look at the genealogy itself. It's an interesting thing. If you count the number of people, there'll be 10 people mentioned in this genealogy. Now, one thing we can understand about genealogies in the Bible, and this is the difficulty at times of taking genealogies, not every biblical genealogy mentions every person. Sometimes they leave out generations. In fact, we've looked at times where it said he's the son of blah, 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 when he could be the great-great-great-grandson of, but he's in the line of, is what it means. So genealogies aren't always meant, when we do a family tree, we put everything in there. Sometimes that doesn't happen. For instance, I forget if it's Matthew or Luke, but there's 14 generations from this to this and 14 generations from this. There's 14. There's uniformity, 14 there, because that's what the author was going for, to see the highlights from this to this, from this to this. I think it was from Adam to Abram, from Abram to, I'd have to look up anyway, and then to the exile. Here, there's 10 names. There's 2 other times in the Hebrew Bible where there are 10 name genealogies. And so as a reader from that culture, you would recognize that parallelism, I think. And the 2 other times are in the book of Genesis. The first one is Genesis 5. There are 10 names from Adam to Noah. Are those 2 pretty important names? Adam and Noah. And the next one is in Genesis 11. There are 10 names from Noah's son Shem to Abram. Pretty important names. Adam, Noah, Abram. And now this 10 name genealogy, David. I think the point the author here in Ruth is doing is trying to draw back those to see these very significant names, what God did in creation, in redemption, in setting aside a people, and saying, here's the continuation, here's the next 10 you need to know about. You remember those 10 and how important they were. Here's the next 10, because the end point, David, he's the one that's the next step in the salvation of his people, Israel. I think that's very purposefully done, that number of people in the genealogy, because she had to reach back in the authorship. This doesn't start with Boaz and Ruth. It reaches back a few generations to get 10 as vitally important.
So those 4 names is the most, I guess, account that talks about genealogies.
In the
Adam and
in the salvation history of Israel,
uh-huh.
those are all very significant names.
Right, okay.
Adam, creation. Noah,
Yeah.
the ark. Abram, the people.
Mm-hmm.
And David, the king.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's not all the significant names, but those are pretty significant names in the unfolding story of God's, from creation to salvation, the coin phrase that we show up here every day. Wait, show it to you. I think it's the next slide, right? Boom, from creation to salvation. There are the 10 names. All right. I could say more, but I think I've said enough. Let me look at my notes.
So who's 10 down from David?
What's that?
Who's 10 down from David?
I have no idea.
I was just curious, because that would be us. Jesus.
I'll look it up in Chronicles in the Bible. That's your homework.
14, it might be Matthew.
I think from David to Jesus was 14 there.
Is that right?
I don't know, but I know one of them was 14.
Yeah, Matthew 1:17. There are 14 generations from Abram to David, 14 from David to the exile, and 14 from the exile to the Messiah.
Okay.
Are there only 14 generations?
No.
If you go back and look,
Because if the generation turned out to be bad, they probably just forgot about it and kept moving.
right. And the other thing is, if you look at that genealogy, I already said Ruth is in it, but in a patriarchal society, you're mostly going to have men. And there are 3 women, I believe, in this genealogy of Jesus: Ruth, Rahab, another woman, Ruth, a Moabite, not an Israelite, brought in. Rahab, a non-Israelite, a prostitute that rescued the people. And of course, Mary, because Mary, right? I mean, there's no human father at that point. So we trace the line through David. So we start. So, if you're a Jewish reader, you're going, whoa, this is significant. What's up with this? And of course, that's why Matthew did it that way, because he's trying to communicate to the people of Israel, Jesus is the fulfillment of the messianic promise to David. And so he grabs those names, and those would be pretty significant. Again, salvation, Rahab helped save the people from the Jericho situation. She saved the spies from getting captured and killed. Ruth is this picture of faithfulness, that the line of David was about to end. Elimelech, done. What happens if Ruth never gets married and doesn't have Obed? There's no Jesse. There's no David. things are about to be, the promise that would come to David is as good as dead until this Moabite woman shows incredible faithfulness first to Naomi and then by her character to Boaz in a way that keeps the story going. Pretty fascinating. Anyway, I'm done with that. That's all I've got to say about that. Any more words before us go? Any thoughts? I know a lot of you like Ruth. Yes, sir.
Back when they were first moved, the girls were married. They lived there for an extended period of time, and yet neither of them produced any children.
Correct.
That was, this said 10 years, then no. That seemed a little strange, but then we get over to where she marries Boaz, and it reads, the Lord enabled her. Perhaps he fiddled away so that they wouldn't, because he knew the right person.
Well, maybe the sons was having
a heritage line.
I would think that's probably a pretty fair thing to say. What happens if she has children in Moab? Naomi's not hopeless. She doesn't have to go back. She can stay there because she's got someone to care for her. And the land is not redeemed.
Only God knows.
That's right.
So a lot of those things there that the sovereignty of God is orchestrating for us that we don't always see on the surface, but must be happening behind the scenes, whether it's in the day the judge is judged or today.
Doreen says she had 2 sons, right?
Ruth had 2 sons.
What was the other one's name, does it say?
I didn't get the names.
No one.
I don't see but one there.
I'm
All right.
Kids didn't move that.
Well, I'm gonna
Now
close
it
this
says
out
1.
What says one?
with a word of prayer, if that's okay.
Now it says 1.
Okay.
Be
I gotta
dismissed.
ask it.
Because I didn't know that.
Siri knows all. Well, let's pray together and then we'll call it a night. Father in heaven, we thank you for your faithfulness to us, your people, for your loving kindness, for your covenant faithfulness, that you keep your promises to 1,000 generations. Lord, we are grateful for the stories like the story of Ruth, this woman who herself embodied that faithfulness in the midst of an unfaithful age and an unfaithful people. God, you proved yourself faithful through the faithfulness of these women. And we thank you for Boaz and his part. And we thank you that we see in this story, even as we just talked about, your sovereign hand at work so that your purposes and your promises would be fulfilled. Father, give us confidence, faith, even in our lives and today, when we don't always understand the details and the difficulties we go through, but we can know that you, as the sovereign Lord of heaven and earth, are at work to accomplish your purposes in and through our lives. So give us patience, give us wisdom, give us that trust in your loving kindness, your hesed, your faithful covenant love demonstrated, especially and finally through Jesus, in whose name we pray.
Amen.